Good afternoon, everyone. You ready? Okay. My name's Kaylee McMahon, and on behalf of the Library Lecture Series here at ZSR, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's presentation by Dr. Michelle Voss Roberts. We have a special introducer today, Dean O'Day, from the School of Divinity, so I'd like to welcome her to come forward and introduce Dr. Voss Roberts.
I don't know if I'm a special introducer, but I know I have somebody special to introduce. How do you like that? Just take that rhetoric right there and make something out of it. It's true, too. So it had a rhetorical flourish, and it's true. What more could you ask for? To many people in this room, because I see many of Professor Voss Roberts' students, but wave your hand. There's students and Professor Voss Roberts. Michelle Voss Roberts teaches at the School of Theology, and as I've said, you're going to Divinity School. Thank you, Neil. I was looking at where she got her degrees from. That's what I confused myself. Thank God my faculty's here to help me out. Michelle has a BA from Calvin College, a Master of Theological Studies from Candler School of Theology, that's where my eye slipped, at Emory University, and a PhD from Emory University in the field of theology. And she teaches in the fields of systematic theology, which if you're not a theologian, you wonder, she can explain it to you maybe during her talk. But systematic theology is trying to have an organized conversation about how we understand God. How's that for thank you. That's how I try to understand it. That's what the systematics means. Right? Michelle is a pioneer, I think that's a very fair and apt description, in an important new field in comparative theology, which takes different religious perspectives on the understanding of God and tries to have not any one theology dominate, but really to be in a mutual conversation about what do we learn about God and about human beings and relationship to God by this comparative conversation. And Michelle is a pioneer. It did start, there's a generation before her, but she is definitely the leader in her generation in this field. And Michelle also works in feminist theologies. She is the author of 2 books, one you're going to hear about today, and over a dozen peer-reviewed articles. Her first book, Dualities, A Theology of Difference, received the award for the best book in Hindu Christian studies. So that was a big accomplishment when the book was published in 2010, and it was the award for the best book in Hindu Christian studies published between 2008 and 2011. And the book she's going to talk out of today that's correct, right? Taste of the Divine, yes. Taste of the Divine, Hindu and Christian Theologies of Emotion, was published by Fordham University Press in 2014. And to prove that I was right when I said it's not so much that I was a special introducer as much as I had someone special to introduce, this book also is an award-winning book that was the recipient of the Award for Excellence in the Study of Religions by the American Academy of Religion at this past annual meeting in 2015. Wasn't it for the comparative study of? That's what I thought. Came off of some other place. The comparative and constructive studies, which is actually about the hardest category. It has the most contenders in that category. So to win an award in that category, and it's a jury of peers, is a big deal. And the citation about the book talked about its creativity, the elegance of its style, and its own on a book on aesthetics, that the book itself has a high aesthetic quality. So it not only does Michelle write about aesthetics, but she writes aesthetically about aesthetics. And as any other academics in the room know, that's not necessarily always an easy thing to do. So, Michelle.
Thank you, Dean O'Day, for the introduction and also for your support of my research, including a research leave that I'm enjoying this semester, which is wonderful. Thank you very much for that. Thanks also to Kaylee and to the library for the opportunity to make this presentation, and also to the students and colleagues who have turned out for this presentation. I'm really kind of overwhelmed to see all of you here. Thank you. I'm going to talk for about less than an hour, which will leave 20-30 minutes for discussion. The research I'm going to share with you is a work of comparative theology. This is a way of thinking about the big questions of faith while studying one tradition alongside another. It's a kind of back and forth movement. A comparative theologian pays attention to how she starts to think differently about the tenets of her own tradition, or even about religion more generally, as a result of that back and forth. And you'll see some of the fruits of this process here. The picture that I chose for the cover of my book, Tastes of the Divine, imagines Christ using symbolism associated with Shiva, the Nataraja, or Lord of the Dance. The fire of creation encircles him, and in his dance, he invites the viewer not to be afraid, and also to come and worship at his feet. The artist, an Indian Catholic named Jyoti Sahi, whom you will meet shortly, explains that he wanted to portray Christ as the dancer who steps across from death to life. It's an image of the resurrection for Easter this week. He was working on this canvas when I interviewed him in his studio in 2010, and I was captivated by it because I also see it as a kind of imaginative stepping across between the Hindu and Christian symbolic worlds. And that, in a way, is what comparative theology does. Now, I wrote Tastes of the Divine before the current election cycle, obviously. Writing this book was a process of becoming attentive to collective expressions of emotion. And as I set out to talk to you today about the role of emotion in interfaith understanding, I'm acutely aware of what happens when a society becomes uncritical of its role, which we're seeing across the political spectrum. The anger of one part of the electorate is stoking apocalyptic fears in others, who then in turn heap scorn and disgust on certain candidates and their supporters. And so we go. And amidst all of this, we're seeing nativist, xenophobic, and racist rhetoric directed against many groups, but Muslims in particular. And this rhetoric is intimately related to these deep human emotions of fear, anger, and disgust. Today's news alone tells the story, right? But here's something a little older. Before the Texas primary, a poll showed that almost half of Texas voters favored a ban on Muslims entering the U.S. And just more than half of those polled said they would disapprove of accepting Syrian refugees, even with a security clearance process. As the numbers break down, more of the people with these feelings were white or Hispanic. African Americans were less likely to support a ban. These numbers are not only about terror, which is a powerful emotion being felt acutely this month in Iraq, Turkey, and Belgium. But in Europe and the United States, Muslims and Syrian refugees also serve as a convenient scapegoat for other collective anxieties of white working people. Their former certainties of a stable job, home ownership, and a better future for their children are waning. Michelle Saraceno analyzes the issue of borders as starting with the permeable borders of the South. The eroding sense of the working and middle-class South contributes to the policing of national borders and to violence toward people who are perceived to cross them. She identifies at least 3 typical adverse emotional reactions to porous borders. Quote, when people fear the other so intensely that they do anything and everything to avoid them, when people feel entitled to borders to the extent that they cannot acknowledge the self, story, or the place of the other, and when numbness to affect prevents them from opening to others in charity. It's important to look at emotions in relation to religious pluralism, because if we as a society are to live up to our own ideals of hospitality, freedom, friendship, and civility, we are going to need to grapple with the affects that come with the complex identities of both individuals and communities. The purpose of my talk is twofold. First, by thinking along with Indian aesthetic theory, I want to argue that emotions can also play a constructive role in interreligious understanding, which can be fostered just as intentionally as the fear-mongering we're seeing now. And I'll discuss peace and love in particular as aesthetic bridges between traditions. Second, I'll suggest that although this theory draws attention to common human patterns of feeling, it can do more than cultivate empathy for religious others. It also has a critical lens that can help us to discern how to respond to particular emotions. And here I'll draw attention to how anger is evoked. My research is in the creative intersection of Hindu and Christian traditions, but the patterns I'm about to describe are applicable more broadly to what we're seeing with Islam right now. These pictures were taken on a trip with my students to India a few years ago. We're at the ashram of the artist I mentioned before, Jyoti Sahi, and he's sitting there in the middle. He's not one of our students. What strikes me about this scene is how obviously enraptured we are by what Jyoti is saying as we sit together in his chapel. He's not telling us what to think about Hinduism or Christianity, but he's helping us to become familiar with these traditions at a deeper level. There's a sense of wonder as he tells stories from Indian culture and evokes their meaning with his art. This resonance across religious contexts points to a level of human connectedness. We're drawn in by a good story, and we can feel something of the flavor it has for the people who tell it. Because of this basic connection between human beings, religious images, stories, and practices exert rhetorical force. And they can exert this effect not only on the intended audience of religious insiders, but on outsiders as well, like us. Another way of putting this is that the affects and emotions that might be described as religious can occur for a person not only in the context of their own communities, but also in the sacred spaces of other traditions. So, as an example, when I think about Meena, who was my host during my first summer in India, I recall the tenderness with which she showed me the part of her home where she offers daily prayers to the images of the deities that are important to her family. I was studying Sanskrit at the time, and I found myself surprised about how moving it was to catch bits and pieces of the chants she sang as she offered water and incense and food. So our assessments of other religions don't take place only on a rational level, just comparing doctrines for their relative truth or error. Our assessments also take place on a deeply affective, embodied, and emotional level. While another religion's apparent strangeness can repel us, its wisdom and beauty can also attract us. Indian aesthetic theory helps us understand the role of emotion in both religious and interreligious experience. Aesthetic theory does more than describe beauty. It tries to account for what happens to people when they encounter a powerful work of art. I'll give you an example from making music. My college orchestra conductor, Daryl D. Young, used to talk about goosebump moments. And that's when all the factors come together: the tuning of the instruments, the skill of the performers, the vision of the composer, the insight of the conductor, and the attention of the audience. When everything converges just so, music can be pure bliss. The heart and body of a well-attuned audience member will pick up on these intense instances of transcendent feeling. The mind, body, spirit similarly knows these goosebump moments through religious experience, which has aesthetic dimensions. We experience it in the Divinity School, when we worship with hymns in four-part harmony, heartfelt praise choruses, protest songs, or simple Taizé chants. I can look around in Davis Chapel and observe that others are feeling this too. They express it by closed eyes or raised hands, shouts of hallelujah, or silent tears. Sometimes it's difficult to tell where aesthetic experience ends and religious experience begins. And so I'd like for us to think about interfaith encounters in terms of this relationship. Indian theologians call upon an important aesthetic category, rasa, to account for the ways that religious experience is simultaneously transcendent and embodied. This concept has a long and varied history in relation to the religions of India. The basic meaning of rasa is sap, juice, or the essence of a thing. And from this meaning derives secondary senses of tasting and aesthetic relishing. Third, rasa signifies the blissful, transcendent culmination of aesthetic experience. So if a performance has been successful, then the audience has one of those goosebump moments, right? And they taste aesthetic bliss. Finally, rasa denotes 9 basic emotional states, each of which is called rasa. A love story, an epic about war, a religious biography, and a comedy all have different emotional flavors. Any given drama might have one of these as its main rasa or emotional focus. In South Indian cuisine, there's a soup called rasam that accompanies most meals, and it has this name because of its distinct flavor, which can only be produced by a particular combination of elements. In India's classical dance tradition, performers learn to execute the recipes for each of the basic emotions, and a seasoned audience member learns to savor them. So I'm going to show you a dance piece in the Bharatanatyam style, which many young women of Indian descent learn as part of their cultural heritage. This piece is called Nava Rasa because you will see all 9 rasas depicted in turn. They're going to go by quickly, so I'm going to name them. I'll name the rasas as the dancer shows them. First is love. Humor or laughter. Compassion. Fury. Courage or heroism. Fear. Disgust. Wonder. And peace. You probably didn't need me to read those out to you, because, but you notice what an excellent student of the expression of emotion a dancer has to be to do this style of music. The texts that teach how to do this pay really close attention to eyebrow movements, cheeks, mouth. Every part of the body is involved in expressing these emotions, so you had no trouble understanding the emotion she was trying to depict. The aesthetic tradition of rasa, of which you just got a taste, stems from Bharata's Natya Shastra, a text that outlines those specific dramatic techniques for evoking emotion in an audience. According to a part of it, a very short little part called the Rasa Sutra, Rasa arises through the combination of three things: excitants, or vibhavas, indicators, or anubhavas, and transitory emotional states, vyabhichari bhavas. For example, a drama about love would evoke it through excitants like a garden and a full moon, indicators like lovers gazing at one another, or an individual daydreaming maybe, and transitory or compatible emotional states like the anger of a lover's quarrel. We saw some of those factors in the dance number, the smiles, the sidelong glances, for example, but we would experience love more robustly in the setting of a narrative, where sweet words and romantic plot points could heighten the emotion for us. Rasa seems to have had connections with religion early on. Susan Schwartz argues that India's aesthetic tradition is deeply religious in origin and in context. She argues for religion as performing arts in India. Art is produced in praise of the divine, but Rasa's blissful transcendence also has a divine source. The Taittiriya Upanishad describes Brahman, or the universal divine spirit, in terms of rasa, as something that can be savored or tasted experientially. Later philosophers and theologians use rasa as a subtle framework for elaborating an analogy between aesthetic and religious experience. The 10th century philosopher and literary theorist Abhinavagupta elaborates this. For him, the relishing of rasa, rasaswada, can prepare the spectator to relish ultimate reality, brahmaswada, because both culminate in a state of blissful, egoless, generalized contemplation. So rasa is unlike ordinary emotion, which we feel on a personal level. In other words, when I watch a love story, I'm not the one in love, right? The feelings are not mine, but I contemplate love from a distance and I taste it kind of in the abstract. And that's why Abhinavagupta argues that the rasa of peace is not only one of the 9 basic emotions, but peace is also present at the culmination of all aesthetic experience, insofar as that culmination is contemplative and blissful. Experiencing rasa is therefore conducive to the pursuit of liberation, or moksha, which transcends the ego. In the context of devotional movements, the religious use of rasa moves away from the dispassionate contemplation of emotion toward its intensification as devotional feeling, or bhakti rasa. In the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, which worships Krishna as the ultimate reality, Donna Wolf explains the devotion is a fundamentally aesthetic one, in which the development of bhakti towards the Lord involves a gradual refining and intensifying of emotion through repeated encounters with the eternal drama of Krishna and his close associates. Passionate love for Krishna, rather than disinterested peace, becomes the supreme emotion. This image is a famous scene in Krishna's story. As a young man, he is so attractive that everyone in the community is drawn to him. And you see him depicted here as he usually is, with blue skin. In the center, he dances with his eternal consort, Radha, who is incarnate as this young gopi woman. She's a cowherder in this rural community. As the story goes, Krishna plays his flute, and its entrancing sound awakens the women, married and single alike, and draws them into the forest to meet with him. When they arrive at this clearing, they form a circle and dance together in love. Krishna miraculously multiplies himself so that each woman feels as if he is dancing with her alone. This circle is the epitome of divine human love. Love of God causes devotees to abandon their respectability, symbolized by the married women risking everything to be with Krishna. And there you see in the, so this dance is actually called the Rasa Leela, and it's evoking so much love that the gods are sitting in the boats watching it. They're savoring the mood of devotional love. In the 20th century, Rasa has leapt its cultural and religious bounds. And so you have comparisons happening with between Rasa and Western concepts like catharsis, and also non-Hindu theologians who use the concept to analyze their own scriptures and experiences. So in this woodcut, the woodcut is by Jyoti Sahi, and he worked with a German theologian to explore the emotional universe of the Psalms. And they actually go through all of the 9 rasas. This one is the one that they do for courage. And they pair this woodcut with a passage from the Psalms and the Mundaka Upanishads. Their explanation is, in these meditations, we do not so much consider heroic courage, not the single courageous act for which daily life gives us rarely an opportunity, but the courage to submit to God's protection and the courage to carry on with our daily lives indefatigably. The well-known simile from the Mundaka Upanishad of the arrow of our soul, which must be pointed at God as its target, certainly suits the mentality of the psalmists, who consider life as a battle and describe their struggle for God and for a happy, peaceful life in the community of their people with images from battle and war. So one thing that I'd like to point out from all of these examples of rasa in the religious sphere is that religious experience, for all the ways that people experience it as transcendent, as raising them out of the mundane moment to encounter the divine, religious experience is also profoundly rooted in the senses, emotions, and devotional practices. And if we recognize the particular sensory and embodied components of religious experiences, we have a very useful way to account for similarities and differences between them. Okay. Having introduced you to the theological legacy of Rasa, I'd like to propose that Rasa can help us theorize how aesthetics can be a bridge between religious traditions. Rasa illuminates how people can come to understand and appreciate one another on an intuitive, embodied human level through religious art, worship, and texts. This is not only an argument for what is common in humanity, because it also accounts for what is culturally specific by analyzing the excitants, indicators, and accompanying emotions of religious performances that might initially seem strange to outsiders. For example, I know you could identify the general emotions in the video I showed you, but if you were going to watch a full dance drama, you might have some difficulty identifying the specific vocabulary of the hand gestures, right? That's a whole vocabulary that you have to learn that's culturally specific. Because Rasa covers the range of human emotion, it also covers a range of religious experience. So we can understand the aesthetics of other faith traditions if we become appreciative and cultured spectators of religious emotion. Rasa smooths the transition from experience of another tradition to theological engagement with it. Allow me to make another pass at the core emotions of peace and love to explain what I mean. So we'll start with peace. Experiences of meditative peace can serve as aesthetic bridges between traditions. This is the Satchidananda Chapel at the Catholic Center in Bangalore, India. It's known as the NBCLC. And it was designed, you might guess, by Jyoti Sahi, my favorite artist for this book. A little background is in order to understand this building. Following the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, churches around the world were encouraged in the project of inculturation, which is expressing the Christian faith in idioms native to particular contexts. The NBCLC was founded following the council to continue the initiative that was already underway in projects such as the Christian ashram movement, where Christian missionaries in India took on the garb of Hindu holy people, studied the wisdom texts of India alongside the Bible, learned to meditate in Indian ways, and formed a community, an ashram, for this kind of activity. During this period, the center produced writings, liturgies, and art that embraced many symbols from India's religious traditions. The NBCLC's early art and architecture were replete with meditative ideals. They held a weekly mass, conducted primarily in Sanskrit, and they later established a company of classically trained dancers to promote the gospel through Bharatanatyam, the dance form you saw earlier. So, let's look at how this chapel inspires the Rasa of peace. Crossing the threshold of the structure, you would instinctively become quiet and attentive. You've left your shoes behind you on the steps, and now it feels as if you're treading on holy ground. The space is a kind of axis mundi, or a cosmic tree, planted where the horizontal and vertical dimensions meet. On the horizontal axis, the chapel marks a square. It's a symbol of fullness. It's the basic orienting structure for Hindu temples. And the lines crossing the room provide a mandala, a kind of visual meditation. They represent the space of the cosmos, which is replicated in the space of the heart. The windows hold grills with imagery that's resonant across Indian religious traditions. You see here a monk in a yogic posture of meditation next to Mary praying with Jesus in the cave of her heart. That cave of the heart is a traditional symbol from the Upanishads. In other windows, you find the 4 stages of life together with the 4 gospels, the Upanayana Hindu initiation ceremony for men, side by side with a symbol of the Christian sacraments, and the Buddha receiving hospitality as a beggar, with Abraham and Sarah welcoming divine guests unaware. So these inspire meditation when they're juxtaposed with one another. In addition to these many details, traditional Indian symbols of devotion, such as oil lamps, garlands of fresh flowers, and a lotus-shaped altar, all accentuate a feeling of peace. Now, on the vertical axis, a central column rises as the focal point. It culminates in a 7-tiered tower that blossoms at the top into a 6-petaled lotus. But the column actually begins on the inside with symbols representing the elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether, from the gross to the subtle. The order on the altar replicates the yogic scheme of the body. In yogic and tantric systems of meditation, the breath rises and the consciousness moves upward toward greater subtlety, toward union with the spirit. The yogic system of the chakras represents this experience and are employed in meditation to evoke it. So here, each of the lower chakras is represented by one of the elements, and then meditation on them is supposed to ascend to the opening above the crown of the head, where one tastes union with the divine. Here, ensconced in the cave of the heart again, is the tabernacle containing the Eucharistic host, the Word made flesh, descended to dwell among humanity. The vertical thrust directs the attention upward to union where the lotus blooms above. And by the way, one need not be familiar with these cultural symbols to feel peace here. The space does it for you. The verticality, soft lighting, quiet mood, and other indicators of peace evoke it at a physical level. It's like when you first walk into a great cathedral. If you've been talking loudly, you sort of instinctively fall quiet. You don't have to be Catholic to sort of experience it as a cathedral as feeling holy, right? So it's my contention that embodied experiences like these can at least bridge conversations about religious experience. Here's another example. Love. Christians will have no trouble recognizing the affect of love, purified and directed toward God, as a flavor of religious experience. Our Divinity students have sung many a love chorus to Jesus. But even if you don't immediately recognize the language of erotic love as religious, learning about the Hindu tradition might send you back to rediscover or even reclaim something within your own tradition. The preeminent theologian of the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, Rupa Goswamin, elaborates 5 modes of devotional love, bhakti rasa, for initiates in the tradition to imitate. Depending on their particular temperament, individuals might relate to Krishna in the modes of peaceful, respectful, friendly, parental, or erotic love. Each derives from modes of relating to Krishna in the Bhagavata Purana, which is the main scripture of that tradition. Peaceful love is a bit like Abhinavagupta's notion of rasa. A devotee relates to Krishna through calm contemplation or awe. The other modes are progressively more intimate. Krishna's servants, his friends, but the affection of Krishna's parents, or especially his lovers, are the ultimate experiences of divine love. Rupa elaborates in great detail the excitants, indicators, and transitory emotional states that foster these loves, alongside practices such as reading scripture, serving divine images, and devotional singing. A form of drama called the Rasa Leela, which culminates in the dance that you see depicted in this picture. That form of drama is one of the principal means of evoking these emotions. So all of these practices are the excitants, indicators, and so forth for devotional love. Stories about Krishna have reminded Christians of the eroticism of the Song of Songs, which has a long history of allegorical interpretation as the love between God and the church, or in Bernard of Clairvaux's sermons on the Song of Songs, an allegory for the love between Christ and the individual believer. So on the right side, you see an initial letter from a medieval Bible along these lines. It shows Christ and the soul as his queen. For Bernard, as for Rupa, nuptial love is superior to other forms of love. He calls it a bond stronger than even nature's firm bond between parents and children, that parental love. It is also the most mutual of all emotional experiences of the divine. Using masculine bridegroom imagery for God, he writes that when God loves, he desires nothing but to be loved, since he loves us for no other reason than to be loved. He is also interested in the imaginative devotional practices that will kindle love for God and the believer. So in these features, love's superiority, its mutuality, and its ability to be inspired through devotional practices, this Christian love of God is comparable to Hindu love of Krishna. Peace and love are just two examples that the aesthetic and emotional tenor of religious experience offers at least the beginnings of interreligious understanding. As with peace and love, other rasas, such as courage, playful humor, and wonder, can resonate in familiar ways across faiths, even when the narratives and symbols that mediate these emotions are initially unfamiliar. When we as observers are swept up in the power of these emotions, we experience rasa in its theological sense. Our ordinary affects are transmuted into a sense of aesthetic awe. Immersed in rasa, we suspend habitual attachments to identity, which, according to both Hindu and Christian mystics, is just what happens when one tastes union with the divine. These kinds of resonances cause some theologians to conclude that human religious experience shares a common core across culture, time, and place. And not everybody agrees with that thesis, and that's okay. Rasa theory helps us there too, because it helps us understand how religious and cultural differences can spark theological reflection. Encounter with difference can lead to denial or denunciation of one's neighbor, but more positively, it can intensify some aspects of one's own identity, or even lead to subtle shifts in one's theology. At the beginning of this talk, I promised that I would not only argue that emotions are aesthetic bridges that lead to interreligious understanding, but that I would also draw on Rasa theory to show that critical analysis of how emotion is evoked can guide our responses to particular emotions. So I should tell you that not everybody has a sense of the holy when they experience the NBCLC chapel. In fact, it makes a lot of Christians furious. So what are the excitants, indicators, and accompanying emotions of their anger? What goes into producing and expressing this rasa? One reason for this is that although it embodies an Indian aesthetic that they share, and also a spiritual sensibility, it's a sensibility characteristic of one cross-section of Indian society, the Brahmin or priestly caste. These are the people largely responsible for the canon of Indian wisdom literature that you're likely to be learning about in your world religions classes, the Vedas, the Upanishads, parts of the Bhagavad Gita, and so on. But this is also the caste that's benefited from the stratification of Indian society. So again, this may be review for some of you, but you may know that there are 4 major classifications in Indian society, at least theoretically: the Brahmin, the priest, Kshatriya warrior, Vaishya merchant, and Shudra farmer or worker. In reality, these castes or varnas are broken up into thousands of subcastes or jatis. But for people designated as Shudra or even below that as untouchable, the social oppression as a result of being excluded from Brahmanical religion has been profound. Untouchability has been illegal in India since independence, but it still functions. So this group, the untouchable group, which prefers the name Dalit, meaning broken, crushed, or oppressed, this group can express a lot of anger about that kind of spirituality. You can understand how this way of ordering society might appeal to a Brahmin, but not a Shudra or a Dalit. For example, most Christians in India are Dalits, and when they see the NBCLC chapel and all the Hindu imagery, they don't feel at home or inspired. They are very uncomfortable because these symbols they experience these symbols of having been oppressive for them. The anger that alerts a person that something is not quite right can become a religious emotion. We see this in the righteous anger of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, or Jesus driving out the money changers from the temple, or contemporary prophets against injustice. I'm going to show you a clip with part of a street performance by Dalit activists in which they symbolize the necessity of rising up against oppression. Allow me to summarize the narrative and dramatic elements that come first. These women take the stage against a backdrop depicting a rural Indian village. Each holds a parai, the round, flat hand drum with which their ancestors announced the deaths of members of the wider community. At first, they dance proudly and happily with really complex and exciting rhythms and footwork. But after a little while, a landowner with a long staff and a whip arrives, and he demands that they work for him. The dancers then huddle together, and they're afraid and they're confused. The landowner makes one of the dancers get down on her hands and knees so that he can use her as a chair, and he orders the rest of them to dance. Their beat loses its complexity. Bent low in fear, their feet shuffle rather than dance. But as they move, the women organize themselves. They start a slow beat. Their leader declares that they cannot face such forces alone, but need to band together. So they stand and surround their taskmaster, trapping him in the middle of their circle. Now he is afraid. Unable to run, he falls to the ground. The choreography expands so that the dancers step on him in time with the beat. He lies still on the ground and does not get up. The women smile once more as they dance in victory. So you see that as the piece is ending, several performers have constructed a pyramid so that they stand tall over their vanquished oppressor. And one drummer rests with her knee on his back, and a couple of others give him a final kick. You might be surprised at the violence of this image, muted as it is, but the director of the organization that produced this street drama espouses a philosophy of nonviolence and explains that this scene illustrates the energy needed for the people to rise up against oppression. We find a similar philosophy among many Dalit Christian activists. This text comes from a liturgy written by Dalit theologians at Tamil Nadu Theological Seminary, which confronts the history of caste, gender, class, and clerical privilege in their curriculum and in their ministries. This excerpt is from their Liturgy for Common Worship, which enacts a healing process of anger, confession, and forgiveness. So the pastor announces, "This is the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it." The community pushes back. How can we rejoice in the Lord when Dalits suffer atrocities by the dominant caste forces, police officials, and male chauvinists? The congregation then has an opportunity to narrate its experiences, and then individuals stand to ask and to receive pardon. In that section, the pastor begins by confessing the temptation to treat his or her vocation as an opportunity to dominate over others. Non-Dalits confess to using Dalits as slaves and propping up the injustices of the caste structure. Men confess to the failure to treat women as equals. The rich acknowledge their responsibility for the condition of the poor. And after each confession, the wronged group expresses forgiveness, even if, as the women respond to the men, we find it difficult to believe that you sincerely feel sorry for all that you've done to us all these years. It's right there in the liturgy. After each confession, the two parties share objects of symbolic reconciliation, and the ceremony concludes with Eucharist. So anger, expressed liturgically, can speak the truth of long and ongoing abuse. It can rally oppressed groups to action. It can hold perpetrators accountable for injustice. It can, although it by no means always will, lead to reconciliation. Thinking interreligiously now, like peace and love, fury and other so-called negative emotions can serve as aesthetic bridges. Terror and disgust at violence can awaken solidarity, as can compassion for fellow creatures. These kinds of shared feeling enable people of different religions to stand with one another. We've seen this, I think, in many of the interfaith responses to terrorism, as well as in interfaith community organizing. But notice the shift. You'll remember that initially, Rasa was a completely disinterested experience felt by the cultured audience member or a yogic sage in contemplation who transcends the troubles of mundane reality. Over time, with the devotional movement, there was more of a sense of personal investment. Bhakti rasa is not only love in the abstract, but one's own love for God. But even though rasa had become more personal, it was just as otherworldly. It was an inward, individual relationship with God in one's heart. It transposed one to heaven, as it were. Despite all of the erotic imagery in scriptures, Christians and Hindus alike are very clear that it's only imagery. It has nothing to do with erotic or embodied relationships in society. But with justice work, bodies and their lived realities come directly into view. Good observers of anger will be suspicious of the aspects of religion that discourage people from looking too closely at material conditions. Rasa, though, is always evoked by material conditions, and this is part of its critical purchase. So if rasa names the awe and attraction of interreligious encounter, insofar as participants are like the audience of an exquisitely executed drama, rasa also provides an analytical tool, a means of reviewing their performance. It asks us to pay attention to what factors are exciting strong emotions, how people are expressing it, and what other implications it carries. So I'll give another example from the Indian context. Theophilus James Apavu was a theologian and a songwriter who was central to the development of Dalit Christian activism at Tamil Nadu Theological Seminary. He challenges the Church of South India for its preference for Western and classical Indian music forms, which he thinks blunts the Church's ability to act in solidarity with the oppressed. He says, "We cannot change society without agitation or protest. Which music will initiate this protest?" And then he quotes some lyrics which mean, "Be at peace and don't be angry." And he says, "When high caste people beat and rape our women, should we watch and not get angry? Are you kidding? What does this music do? It quiets and calms us down. Not just the content of the song, but the music itself is like that. The musical sound or effect of classical music quiets and soothes the mind, and the person becomes tame. As soon as we sing, the listener will become drugged, like taking alcohol. This music is not fit for the struggle. It's too melodious, right? So it's not a recipe for liberative work in the world," he thinks. The courage and anger necessary for Dalit activism, Apavu believes, cannot be evoked through the music of the dominant classes. Classical music tends toward transcendence. It functions as an opiate of the masses insofar as it pacifies Christians when they should be roused to bold action. So Apavu's own compositions for the church draw directly on the folk forms, rhythms, and instrumentation of village Dalits, with lyrics that are very easy for ordinary people to remember and sing. Returning home. Attention to the embodied foundations of feeling can also help participants in interreligious dialogue to make discerning judgments about what we encounter. When does appreciation of contemplative arts or admiration for another tradition's sincere love for God lull a person into contented interiority? When does wonder stunt our critical faculties? Can compassion, disgust, fury, or terror alert us when something is wrong? For example, to power imbalances between dialogue partners? We must also examine gut reactions such as disgust or terror. Have we been conditioned to react negatively to religious or racial others by cultural prejudice instilled by family, leaders, or the media? When are those emotions the result of propaganda, right? Very specific recipes for evoking emotion. When do they manipulate us for political gain? When are feelings exploited for violent purposes? Are they the result of contemplating our neighbor's faith or somebody else's portrait of it? When we read the recipe for these emotional tastes, we can learn how such affective states arise and make more informed judgments about their truth and our response to them. My argument then has been that religious experience is always embodied, and therefore interreligious dialogue takes place on an embodied and aesthetic plane. Because peace, love, fury, and other emotions orient communities across religious lines, people of different faiths can understand one another on the basis of the shared experience of having bodies and feeling emotions. This is happening on our campus, I think, when our classes visit houses of worship, when dialogue enables students to listen to the experiences of others, and when the religious student associations work together in the spirit of pro humanitate. I hope that I've been able to convey Rasa theory as a helpful tool for these experiences, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks. I will field questions. I can see everybody. I'm ready. Josh. Sure.
Hi, I'm Josh. So I'm working on Theology, who believed love that was an attractive force of such a measure that it literally holds the atoms of the world together. I'll say all that just to make it clear that I'm on the side of love. But you opened by talking about politics, and especially the current political situation. And it seems to me that in American politics sometimes that it makes strange bedfellows, that you'll have groups from very different religious backgrounds in terms of dogma and doctrine who will come together over a shared experience, perhaps of fury or disgust. And I wonder if these aesthetic bridges are sometimes quite dangerous, that this coming together, which may perhaps be a kind of interreligious dialogue, is in fact a force for injustice, a force against liberation, something that's quite dangerous indeed.
Yeah, I think you're right, and that's where I think the critical dimension is really important. The so-called negative emotions, and you notice that compassion was actually listed in there, which is kind of weird, but it's sort of a pleasure-pain dichotomy, right? And so peace is in the middle and is not on either side. But I think you're right that that terror, anger, and disgust deserve special scrutiny, although peace and love aren't off the hook either because of the ways that they sort of encourage us to abstract from our context, right? And so critical awareness, I think, is really important in all contexts. So for many people to sort of step back from what we're seeing right now and say, like, how are religious people falling in line with some of what we're seeing? Isn't religion supposed to be about love, right? We're seeing other things come to the forefront. that's why I really think the 2 points that I make need to be held together. It's not just about, oh, we're all people and we all love, and or you and I are really angry, and good thing that helps us form a coalition. But the second critical part, like, what's going on here, right? What's the recipe for this this fellow feeling that we're having? Is this something that that actually fits with our ideals, or is it coming from other places?
So my question is, essay I read by Desmond Tutu, without forgiveness, there is no way forward. He talks about reconciliation, and in that he's speaking about reconciliation, also encompassing a lot of what I could consider the aspects of negative Rasa. And so, and the fact that that's actually a good thing. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak to how we can use the negative Rasas to create reconciliation, particularly in our current political context.
Yes, I think that's really good. If you think about the reconciliation commissions, where it wasn't about let's just let bygones be bygones, right? People had things they needed to say. They had to express the trauma. They had to express the anger. They had to express the ambivalence. They had to get together and relate to each other on the level of real history and real human feeling that goes with that, right? So this is kind of why I get nervous. So I get nervous when interfaith events really try to steer people away from having strong feelings, right? It's sort of like we're supposed to get together and sing Kumbaya. But if there's something that the community needs to talk about, that can be a space to do it, right? And so I think those commissions were a really good example that the quote unquote negative feelings, like that those are signposts for something that needs to change, right? And so just forgive and forget doesn't actually change the material reality, doesn't change the conditions. And if anything's going to change, if real reconciliation is to happen, then material conditions have to be a part of the conversation. And I think for today too, it's peace and love aren't the only things that direct our attention away from material conditions. I'm starting to realize, and thinking about your question too, because the feelings of anger that are fueling a lot of what we see in the public sphere right now also sort of shut down critical faculties and prevent people from actually seeing their neighbor, right? Rhetoric about Muslims takes the place of actually knowing any Muslims, right? Or actually taking any trouble to find out what's it like to be a Muslim in our community. What do Muslims actually believe, right? You can get fueled up just by your anger, and that seems to be the only thing in the gas tank, right? So again, where's that coming from, and what's materially the reality? Chanchal. Great. Ooh. Yeah, the example that comes immediately to mind is in visual depictions of yoga throughout the colonial period, and the West's shifting opinions about what yoga is. At first it was sort of like this freak show thing, right? And so photographs of sort of really extreme asceticism, like someone whose arm has been up so long that it doesn't come down anymore, or really, pretzel postures, or, feats of, enduring great pain, were really designed, they were a visual rhetoric to design, to evoke amazement, but also kind of a disgust, right? As yoga gained in popularity and became less of a fringe thing, just look at the books that are available for yoga now. You've got very images that are very aesthetically pleasing to our context. Very fit bodies, wearing high-priced gear, laid out in glossy photographs, and this is sort of the epitome of the healthy lifestyle that's to be consumed and desired, right? And everything in between, too. So for spiritual seekers, depictions have evoked more of the sort of peace and meditation and so forth. So I think even looking at shifts over time can be really helpful for seeing what's happening with the colonial legacy. But I'm also positive that your class has really, really good examples of this at the tip of their tongues. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about when Hinduism really came on to the American consciousness at the World's Fair in 1893, Vivekananda was painting a picture of universality, right? And so it was also a sort of rhetoric of one world, peace between all of us, one God, really downplaying the things that would sort of make people scratch their heads, right? And so then suddenly Hinduism was something that everyone was kind of interested in because it seemed to be better than Christianity because it was less divisive and things like that, right? So again, rhetoric that evokes emotion. Catherine, hi.
You hit on it a little bit at the end, but I'd like to hear you spin out a little bit more. Because I think about this bridge, an aesthetic bridge, between two different cultures or faiths, or even communities within the same faith.
Yes.
It strikes me that one side of the bridge often has a fairly strong power differential.
Mm-hmm.
Power relationships play into not only the emotions, but the ways in which those emotions are crafted through the rhetoric. And I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit more about how those power relationships are at work within this concept of Rasa.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was really conscious of my own power. My power to study India, to travel to India, to consume ideas, right? And one thing that the comparative theologian tries to be very aware of is those dimensions. I mean, in the study of religion itself, Christianity has had a really strong hegemony, and so comparison has taken place on Christian terms, has sort of, and so one of the things that is happening here that, it can be viewed in a couple of ways. This could be a Christian sort of going to India and finding something she likes and taking it back and making it her own, right? Another way of framing it could be that it's about time we had what some folks, Rita Sharma and Jose Cabezon, are calling theory parity. It's about time that some of the other traditions started lending concepts to frame the study of religion, right? And so I have not found anything. I've looked in the tradition of theological aesthetics, and there's nothing like Rasa there. And so I think this is a great concept that that can be used much more broadly, and I'm really interested to see how that could develop. And so is this an act of consumption? Is this a move towards greater theory parity? Is it both? Yeah, probably. Right, appropriation. So all of that's going on. But in terms of what you're asking about power differentials in particular cases, it's often the people who are really, who are not being heard, who express themselves with strong emotions, right? I see this sometimes in the classroom. where people get really uncomfortable, right? And so we can even talk about affect and emotion, but we have to do it in a dispassionate way, right? Which I think has to do with cultural communication styles. I think it has to do with sort of, again, wanting to sanitize and hold some of those things at bay. And that can be really tricky as well. I think I might not quite be getting at what you asked, but those are some of the things that kind of resonated from your question.
Where does Rasa interplay with kind of the plurality of worship outside of one's own context?
Great question. I think what we do in Davis Chapel twice a week is exactly this. We're an ecumenical divinity school, which is very exciting because it means people from a lot of different traditions, Christian traditions primarily, will come together, and then we try to worship together, right, twice a week. And it's very interesting because some folks will be like, this isn't how I worship, or I don't feel connected here, right? But if you stick with it long enough, you might get to lead worship. You'll encounter things that feel a little bit more familiar. But chapel is really kind of a practice of tasting another religious modality, right? And it'll shift if this one's not working for you, or if it's not your favorite flavor, but you'll eat it today. That's fine. But it over time, I think, can be a process of coming to understand and appreciate, even if it sort of doesn't become your primary go-to way of relating to God. I mean, your question is a good one, because I think often that the affective response to, say you move to a new place and you're trying to find a place of worship, and you visit once and you're like, that's not it, right? That's not it. And it's really a fascinating and unique type of situation in a divinity school to sort of discipline yourself to do something that you don't quite recognize repeatedly, so that over time you might understand what's going on there, right? And maybe even sort of feel some of why that's important too.
So does Christianity have a parallel to Rasa? Is there
Yeah.
It's not only the, I don't know what to call it, descriptive, but it also provides kind of methodology for making these aesthetic connections.
I haven't discovered a Christian parallel. Initially, when I learned about this, I was reading a lot of the early German romantics, and I thought the sublime was like Rasa. And so it is like Rasa in the earlier sense of the feeling that sort of pulls you out of your context and eliminates duality, and you're sort of momentarily suspended, right, in the face of beauty or grandeur or terror or whatever it is, right? But I couldn't quite find anything along the same lines in terms of the analysis of the components, right? The Rasa Sutra, the things that go together to evoke particular things. It's sort of never quite that concrete. It's much more sort of fuzzy in the Christian tradition to what I can tell. Although there are these practices that have emerged, like in evangelical circles of Christian drama, right? Which I think are trying to do something like what Rasa theory says. Like, you can actually produce in your audience certain religious feelings if you put the recipe together right? If you put on this passion narrative, or think about the rhetoric of like Mel Gibson's The Passion of Christ, right? It's very calculated to evoke a certain religious emotion, right? And so I think maybe the practices are there, and some of the, maybe even homiletical or liturgical practices, right? What is the mood we want to create and so forth. But now Veronis and also Jill, if she were here, could set me right. I don't know how detailed the prescription goes. Like, well, if you really want your audience to feel this, here are some of the ingredients that should go into your talk. I'm guessing there's some of that, right? It comes under rhetoric and things like that. So those are some of the places where I would look for parallels. But this kind of ignited my imagination in such a detailed way. Yeah. Neil, hi.
If aesthetic theory manipulate responses,
Mm-hmm.
how does that relate to the old Chicago school notion of religion as sui generis, that religious response is completely of itself, unrelated to other things?
I kind of don't buy that after writing this book. Yeah, and so I alluded a couple of times in the talk about theories that there's like this common core, and all religions are really about feeling the same thing, but just expressing it with different languages and images. And I think that the commonality comes insofar as we have bodies, right? I mean, they're not that different from each other, and bodily experiences. Well, emotions are bodily experiences, and so there are a lot of things we share in common as a species, but I don't think that I would place it on the material side rather than on sort of some transcendent thing that religion is and sort of injects into the world. Yeah. Well, those are really good questions. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, then I will thank you very much for spending an hour and 15 minutes with me today. And if you're interested in the books, they're over there at a discount price. But thank you just so much for being here.